Hi, this is Miss Cortez, and I am your biology teacher, and we are going to be talking about our notes on food chains and food webs. Okay, so let's get into it. So, as I told you last week, we are getting into the unit of ecology, and with the study of ecology, we are studying and focusing on two things: how organisms interact with each other and how organisms interact with their environment. So, the levels of organization and ecology that we're going to focus on. So, if you remember back to the beginning of the year, we talked about the levels of organization, all the way from atom to biosphere. And the main ones we're going to focus on here is organism to ecosystem. So, as you remember, the organism is just an individual. A population is a group of organisms of one species that can interbreed and live in the same place. A community is all the biotic things in an area. So, for example, here we would be talking about, okay, this would be the grass, this would be the trees, this would be the different types of animals. That is going to be a community. When we get into an ecosystem and we're talking about ecosystems and environments, we're talking about all the biotic and abiotic things in an area. So, all of the plants, animals, abiotic factors, like the water in the streams, the dirt, the rock, the sun, clouds, weather. So we get into more specific examples when we talk about an ecosystem. So we're talking about pretty much everything in a specific area. So, how do living things eat their food? Great question. So, autotrophs. These are organisms that use photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, chemical energy to produce food by assembling abiotic compounds into macromolecules. So, we basically learned about this process when we were talking about photosynthesis. So, it's the ability of plants to be able to turn chemical energy and other molecules into sugars, which can be stored and they can go through cellular respiration and use this sugar as energy later. So, our autotrophs are organisms that provide food for all other living things. That's why they are called primary producers. So, you'll hear the term autotroph and primary producer interchange. Examples of autotrophs are like plants or phytoplankton. Heterotrophs are our other types of organisms. So these are organisms that get their energy through ingesting or eating other organisms. So an example of this would be a rabbit eating some grass, or you eating a cheeseburger, or you feeding your cat kibble. Like all of these are heterotrophs. So anything that has to eat something else to survive is going to be a heterotroph. So there's different types of consumers when we are talking about heterotrophs. So we have carnivores, herbivores, omnivores, and then the whole category of scavengers, decomposers, and detritivores. Okay. So carnivores, they are organisms that kill to eat. So this would be like lions and our other predators. Herbivores, they eat plants. These are zebra. This is usually going to be things that are more along prey. And then omnivores, they eat plants and animals. So humans are an example of this because we eat both plants and animals. Another animal that would be an example of this are like raccoons. They'll eat meat, but they also eat a lot of plants. Bears do the same thing. They'll definitely eat salmon, but they also eat berries and roots and other stuff too. Scavengers, decomposers, and detritivores, they eat already dead stuff. So, an example of scavengers would be like vultures. Raccoons would also fall into scavengers too because they're known as things called opportunists. So, they are willing to eat whatever they can, which is why they go through trash a lot. Um, Decomposers are usually things like earthworms and mushrooms. So these are things that eat things that are dead. They consume them. Also, mushrooms are more of an animal than a plant, if you just wanted to know that. It is true. So they eat things that are already dead. Detritivores is just a more fancy word for decomposers. Detritivores eat detritus, which is like a mixture of dead biotic materials. So, how do these organisms interact with each other? Let's get into it. So, food chains, you may remember these from like middle school science. So, these are pretty simplistic. So, a food chain shows the energy flow through an ecosystem in a one way stream from primary producer to various consumers. So, our food chain is just a series of steps in which organisms transfer energy. Food chains can vary in length and change by eating or being eaten. So, you can see that we can have 3, 4, 5 organisms in a food chain. We usually don't get beyond 5 organisms in a food chain, um, just because of the way that energy is passed through different consumers. And we will talk about that in a second. So, food webs. In real life, things are way more complicated than the single path of a food chain. So, food webs are a series of interconnected food chains that kind of realistically show the many ways energy is transferred. So, as we know, like, for example, like a food chain could be like, okay, we have our flower, which a butterfly pollinates and takes the nectar, and then the raven eats it. That's a food chain. But we know in reality that, like, okay, this butterfly isn't the only thing that the raven eats. The raven will eat many different organisms. So we have our food webs to kind of show these more complex interactions with each other. Okay. So we can see that many things will eat our primary producers, and that we have our primary consumers here, and there's many different things that will eat them. So, how does energy travel? So, you've heard me use the term primary producers and consumers. So, here's more about what they are. So, we use the term trophic level, which is the name of each step in a food web or chain. So, our first level is primary producers. They always come first, and they are consistent of plants, because these are our autotrophs. These are our organisms who are able to produce their own energy from sunlight, or be able to develop it from chemical energy. Okay. So our consumers, they occupy every other level of our food web or chain. So primary consumers are first. These are usually herbivores. So these are plant eaters. Sometimes they're omnivores. Secondary consumers, they're usually carnivores and omnivores. They come next in our food chain or food web. Tertiary consumers, they are third. They can be carnivores or omnivores. And then quaternary consumers, they are fourth. They can be carnivores or omnivores. An important thing to remember is that an organism does not always occupy the same trophic level. So, for example, if we had a bear eating berries, that bear would be a primary consumer. However, if we had a bear eating a salmon, um, and the salmon had eaten algae, then he would be, what would he be? He would be a secondary consumer. But if that salmon had gone ahead and ate an insect who had eaten another insect that had eaten a plant or something, it could be a quaternary consumer. So, or if that insect had eaten just phytoplankton, it could have been a tertiary consumer. So you can see easily, especially when we reflect on our food web, how organisms can change their level of being a primary, secondary, or tertiary consumer. Okay. So ecological pyramids, they are next. So ecological pyramids shows the amount of energy or matter contained in each trophic level of a food chain or web. So an energy pyramid shows the amount of energy available at each level. So basically, with this, we have the 10% rule. So as you travel up the energy pyramid, only 10% of the energy available is transferred on up to the next level. The rest is lost as heat. Okay. So we can see down here on our energy pyramid that 100% of the energy is available with our primary producers. Only 10% of that energy is passed on to our primary consumers, only 1% to our secondary consumers, only 0.1% to our tertiary consumers. So this is why we can only have a limited amount. We usually don't go beyond a quaternary consumer when we are looking at a food chain, okay? Because the amount of energy passed on to the next level becomes so low. So biomass is our next one, and this shows the amount of matter at each level. So biomass is the total amount of living tissue within a given trophic level. So we can see that, like, the most mass is taken up by our plants, then our primary consumers, then our secondary consumers, Finally, our tertiary consumers take up the least amount of biomass. And then our numbers pyramid shows the amount of each kind of organism. We can see that going along with our biomass pyramid, that the majority of organisms in an ecosystem are going to be primary producers, then primary consumers, then secondary consumers, and then we have very few tertiary consumers. So let's get a little more into this. So niches and community interactions. So you can say niche or their niche. It's a tomato situation, but I'll say niche. So habitat. Habitat is a general place where an organism lives. So every species has its habitat based on their range of tolerance, which is an ability to survive and reproduce under a range of environmental conditions. If an organism is in an environment outside of these conditions, it uses too much energy to survive to be able to maintain homeostasis and reproduce. Okay, so if we look at our chart on our right here, we look at like a pond environment with fish. And we can see that dependent on the temperature, it controls how much the fish can tolerate that environment and how well they can survive. So you can see when the temperature is super low, there's no organisms. When it's a little warmer, we get a few fish coming in. And we can see that this is the lower limit of their tolerance between no organisms and very few organisms. So when it's too cold, it takes too much energy for them to just be able to survive. So they don't have enough energy to be able to reproduce. As it gets warmer, we can see at a certain point we hit into our optimum range, and that the temperature is warm enough that they're able to find food easily, they're able to reproduce, and they are able to survive well. As it starts to get too hot again, we can see that we get fewer and fewer organisms, that it's too hot, that it causes stress for these fish. They're not able to reproduce. And then eventually, when it gets too hot, there's no organisms at all. Okay. So each habitat has its tolerance. So, like, organisms base their habitat on their range of tolerance. That's why you only see certain organisms in super cold habitats and certain organisms in super warm habitats, because each organism only has a range of tolerance in which it can take. Okay, so let's talk about more about the organism's role in its community. So their niche is an organism's job or the ecological role it fills to make a living or to survive. So, the organism's behavior and how it interacts with its environment in order to obtain abiotic and biotic resources is that organism's niche. So, what happens when we have a specific role or job that we fill in an environment? Sometimes we can run into competition when we have a niche. So, this occurs when resources are shared or limited. So, the competitive exclusion principle is when two species cannot coexist in a community if their niches are identical. So, for example, if you have two types of barnacles in one community and they are living in the same space as each other, they're going to use the same resources, and one will survive and the other will die off unless adjustments are made. Here you can see we have two types of barnacles and they end up separating from each other, where one survives at an upper level of tide limit and one survives at a lower level of tide limit. And even though they use the same resources, they live in two different spaces, so they are able to both survive. So if they end up being in the same space or overlapping, they end up in direct competition, and maybe one will survive and the other one will not. Another thing that can happen with competition is resource partitioning, which is one species becomes able to use a different set of resources due to evolution through natural selection. So, for example, we could have two types of lizards here that are related to each other, and they both use a tree as their habitat. However, so they're not in competition for the same spots on the tree. There could be one lizard that perches on the sunny surfaces of the tree, or like on the leaves, and then another one perches in the shady branches. So they both can use the tree as their habitat, but they're not in conflict with each other for space. So from there, we get into predation. So we'll get a little more into the different types of interactions between organisms. So predation is an interaction between species in which one species, the predator, kills and eats another, which is our prey. This leads to diverse adaptations in both predator and prey refined through natural selection. So, for example, our prey, there's many different things that can happen to them. So some end up gaining camouflage or chemical defenses. So our tree frogs are a great example of that. So tree frogs are usually bright in color and they can be poisonous. This helps them ward off predators. So if a predator goes to eat it tastes the poison of the tree frog, it's like, oh, this is disgusting. I feel sick. It ends up not eating any more of that type of tree frog. And since it's such a bright coloration, if a predator goes to eat that organism again, usually they remember, ooh, I tried to eat this and it was a bad situation for me. Mimicry is another one, and this is when an organism copycats the appearance of a more dangerous species. So some insects that look like bees or wasps actually aren't. In fact, they are flies and they are unable to sting. So if we look at our dude on the left, that is going to be one of our wasps. And when we look on the dude on the right, he looks like he has a stinger. He looks like he's pretty scary, but he's actually a fly and he is unable to sting. Okay. Another, this kind of gets into our niche again, is keystone species. So these are species that can change an entire community by their removal. So they usually maintain the diversity of that community and by reducing the number of the strongest competitors. Okay. So removal of the keystone species, keystone predator from a community can cause major changes in community dynamics. So an example of this would be sea otters. Uh, so with our sea otters, you can see our little food chain. We have our like kelp here, we have our sea urchins, and we have our otter, and then we have our killer whale. So in the 1800s, they hunted a lot of sea otters for their pelts. They thought they made awesome hats and gloves. So there was a huge decrease in the sea otter population. That had an effect on all these other organisms in the community. So without a decrease in the sea otter population, since they're a food source for our killer whales, we also saw a decrease in the killer whale population. Without the sea otters being there, the sea urchins didn't have anything that were eating them or controlling their population as much. So their population was able to increase greatly. And because these sea urchins, they eat the kelp, they ate more and more of the kelp, and then there wasn't as much kelp for other species because other species now had less food and still had their predators who were eating off of them, which could cause a decrease in them. So you can see how quickly the removal of one organism has a huge impact on the rest of the community that it lives in. So another type of relationships is symbiotic relationships. So this is an interaction between two or more species that live together in direct contact. So this kind of helps community structure. There's three types of symbiotic relationships that we'll talk about, which are mutualism, parasitism, and commensalism. So in mutualism, this is a relationship where both organisms benefit from the relationship. So sometimes you'll see this in shorthand as a plus relationship. So an example of this could be bees and flowers. When bees go around like pollinating different flowers, they end up receiving nectar from the flower, which they can take back to their hive and can be used to like feed their babies along with other people in the hive. So if you look at these like little jelly bags right here on their legs, this is where they have like their nectar stored up. Okay. So basically nectar and pollen. But as they collect the nectar, they also get pollen stuck to their hairy little bodies because, as you can see, the bees are quite hairy. And as they move from flower to flower, they end up sharing pollen from plant to plant. And as you guys know, Pollination is basically how plants are able to reproduce. When we take the pollen from a male flower to a female flower, or from just like flower to flower, if these flowers happen to have both sexual reproduction organs. So it's beneficial for the flowers and it's beneficial for the bees. One organism is able to get the food it needs to survive, and the other organism is able to reproduce. Commensalism. This is where one organism benefits and the other is neither helped nor harmed. So you can see in this one, this is going to be a +0 because one benefits and the other is not benefited, but it's not harmed either. An example of this are egrets. So egrets are usually in Africa. They follow cattle and they end up eating the bugs that are stirred up by the cattle as they walk through the grass. Um, the egret ends up eating the bugs that the cows stir up as they walk through the grass, but the cow's not really harmed nor helped by this because the egrets don't directly eat the bugs off the cows. They just eat the bugs that end up flying up in the air. Parasitism. This is when an organism lives inside or on another organism, and one organism is harmed and the other organism benefits. So this is going to be shorthand a plus-minus situation because one is helped and the other one is harmed. So an example of this would be ticks. They are a parasite. So a tick sucking a dog's blood, the tick ends up getting a meal because it's eating the dog's blood, but the dog is usually harmed by this because ticks often carry diseases which can then be transferred to the dog. These diseases can eventually cause the dog to die. Also, if you have too much of your blood being consumed, you feel really weak and not great. Ticks usually go for a dog's ears because there's not as much hair in that space. And usually the flap of their ear protects the tick from other elements. But that is all I have for you guys today. You guys will have an entry-exit ticket that you will need to do after listening to this presentation. I hope everything is going great for you. And as always, email me if you have any questions. Have a great day. Bye.